Hello, welcome to my talk about whatever it will be about, I don't know yet. As you may have heard, I didn't actually plan to give a talk today, but since Chris just announced I was going to, I thought well, I might just as well tell you something. So the good thing is, it's absolutely up to you what I'm talking about. If you've got any specific questions or wishes, I can talk about, well, let's maybe confine it to my software, unless you want to know about all sorts of news of the world. If there's any specific area you're interested in, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll try and come up with something, maybe some interesting things I've never talked about before. I presume you're all aware I'm doing mainly artworks, a graphics program, Easy Writer, a document processor, tech writer, the same with equations. The Postscript 3 printer driver, a very important addition to the RISC OS world. And finally, Gutenprint, high quality photorealistic printer drivers for mainly inkjet printers. The latest release I've done is Easy Writer and Tech Writer 9.1, which was first shown at last year's Wakefield show. I did present the new features in that edition last year, so I presume you probably know about them. Are there any specific questions anyone has on any of these 4 pieces of software to start?
Well, last year I upgraded to the latest output, and I was playing about with it the other day, and I come across a feature called Skew. And I thought, well, fair enough. But I mean, all I did was put some text in and just drag it about and draw fancy, clever things. But can you apply that to various shapes and?
Yes. Okay.
Because I did try to find in the tutorial guide, but I got myself lost. I went on to a different subject altogether then.
Okay. Skewing, yes, okay. So in general, in artworks you put objects on a page, and these objects can usually be transformed in various ways. And the most common way of transforming is usually, well, the very most common way is, of course, to just drag it around. In general, transforming means to apply a mathematical operation that changes the orientation or the position of an object. You can rotate things, and the skewing tool does a shearing operation. Now, this is probably most obvious when we are at an horizontal position, or in fact it's even most obvious if you apply it to some sort of a rectangle. So the skew tool allows you to skew horizontally or vertically. So let's try it horizontally, and you just shear the object. And that of course applies equally to ordinary shapes and to text. Now the interesting thing, and maybe this is not all too well known, the interesting thing is that even after skewing, the object is still fully editable and is still recognized as what it originally was. I mean, this object down here is no longer a rectangle. It is now an arbitrary parallelogram. But you can still go to the rectangle tool and change, for instance, the corner radius. Now the corners originally are circle segments in an ordinary rectangle with rounded corners. As you can see here, it's just a quarter of a circle. In this skewed case, it's no longer anything like that, but still you can go to the rectangle tool and make the corner, the rounded corner, larger, say from 5 millimeters to 8 millimeters. And that still works even though there is now an additional translation, an additional transformation applied. And that's the general idea of all the mathematical transformation operations in artworks. You can apply most things, most transformations to most objects. In fact, if you drag in a bitmap, now where do I find one? There must be some bitmap around. Well, we'll take some very simple bitmap. Not a very fancy one, I'm afraid. It's just a file icon. You can still go to the skewing tool and skew even that.
I'll be a bit more involved than that when I play.
So, and of course, the same is true if you group various things together. Even though this whole thing is now a group, of course, you can still go and rotate that. In fact, let's just for a change do some vertical skewing. Now it's shearing along the y-axis. As you can see, from an aesthetic graphical point of view, you can very quickly get your objects into a shape that doesn't look very nice anymore, especially with text.
Can I ask, Martin, there, having done just that and got yourself into a terrible mess, which is what I generally end up doing, how can you go back to square one?
Okay, that's a good question. Now let's take this bitmap. We've now distorted this quite a bit, and supposing this was a photo, this wouldn't really be useful. Now there is another feature in artworks which has been there from day one, which is not too well known, and that's the object info box. In fact, it's so unknown that I'll have to try and find it. I always use the keyboard shortcut of Shift F1. There it is, Sprite Info. This box allows you to set up the positioning and scaling of this bitmap numerically. And one side effect of it is that this will hopefully, probably, it may or may not reset the skewing. Let's check. Supposing I change this to a scale 100% and aspect 100%. Another thing, maybe most people wouldn't know what that is. What is the aspect? Now, you can, when you scale an object, you can scale it only in the horizontal direction, so you stretch it, or you can scale it in both directions, so you really enlarge the object. And these are the two different ways of scaling. The scaling affects both directions, horizontal and vertical, whereas the aspect just affects the horizontal direction. So let's see, if I reset this bitmap to 100% scaling, 100% aspect, it becomes smaller again, but unfortunately the skewing persists. In that case, I'll probably have to try and skew this back manually, but I agree that's not a very good thing. I mean, in general, of course, if you get yourself into a mess, there is always undo. But I agree that undo is not always the solution, because it means that if you made some mistake in the beginning and did some proper editing later on other objects, you cannot undo the problem you created at the beginning in some other area of the document without undoing all the other editing you did.
Or you save it before you messed it up.
Yes, with hindsight, that is often a good thing. It's like making a backup just before your hard drive crashes. It's one thing that usually doesn't happen. So there are other operations in artworks that you can sort of undo without using undo, like when you rotate something and you think later, I'd rather have this in its normal orientation horizontally again. You can actually go to the rotation tool and it remembers the current rotation of the object down here. As you can see, it says it's currently at 25 degrees, you input 0 and it's back to normal. And the same would be useful with skewing, but that's not there. So the skew tool actually won't tell you what the current skew factor of this object is. So I'm afraid in that particular case you'd have to try and undo the skewing manually. Finally, last point about skewing. It's funny, I've never talked about skewing before.
Well, like I said, I just found it by accident.
Yes. Of course, with text, oops, you wouldn't normally want to skew text. Not me. There you go. Because, of course, the thing you do with text, you just make it italic, and that introduces a slight skewing that is aesthetically more pleasing than using the skew tool. But of course, should you really want text at a more prominent angle, then of course the skew tool, oops, that wasn't the skew tool, that was the scale tool. The skew tool will allow you to create text that is more oblique than the normal font would give you. And of course it's still fully editable this way. Okay. But okay, while we are looking at artworks, at least I need to show you the latest feature I put in 2 years ago, I think. That was the last time I released a major new version of artworks, and that's the nice new artistic lines. I really love that feature personally, because it makes artworks much more usable as a creative artistic tool. The thing about the lines in a normal, like say draw, is that even though in artworks you can actually draw freehand lines, and they are a lot more useful for an artist than editing control points as you do in draw. The real problem about these lines is that they don't really look like they are drawn, because they have the same width all along the line, and that's not what you would create using any normal real-world drawing tool. So that's where the new artistic lines come in, where you can choose how the width should vary along the line. And if you look at these lines, these look a lot more like they are hand-drawn. And so once we are there, you can actually, we can create things that you wouldn't normally be able to draw at all. But that's still, oops, what have I done? I think the problem is we have a line with right, yes, that we wouldn't want. So if you wanted to have something like this ribbon wave, you can now just draw that as a line in Artworks. And in fact, it is really a line, just like any other line, because you can still go and edit its path using the normal drawing tools. Now try creating that in a package like Draw. Now, creating it in the first place would be really hard, but when you decide, oh, I'd rather have it in a slightly different way, editing it, that would be the really difficult part. So,
Martin, can you have a different coloured outline to the?
Oh, you can. In fact, this one has one.
Different fill colour.
This one has one. If you look very closely, I just didn't make it very thick.
That's right.
And that's another big advantage of this feature. Not only does it finally allow you to give an ordinary line an outline, it also allows you to give an ordinary line a graduated fill. And that's again something you have not been able to do before. So we can have a something that behaves and edits like an ordinary line object with all the nice facilities of dragging control points around, changing the curvature, and so on. In fact, also nice things like being able to extend the line just by clicking on the endpoint and continuing drawing. You can have all that and still have the flexibility of a filled shape, which means you can give it a graduated fill, you can give it an outline around it, and there's one feature I'm particularly proud of, even though it's a bit technical. Supposing we have, let's create a new line. This is the ripple.
Lost it. Oh dear.
Oh, what has happened?
Change screen mode or something.
Okay. So, supposing this thing, this line, crosses itself. And now we look at the place where this happens. It's still putting the red outline, which is a bit too thick now to make the point very well. It's really putting the red outline along the outside. It's not continuing this pattern here. So you instead of creating the instead of having the second part of the line on top of the first one, it really merges the shapes and puts the red outline around. Now that might seem a pretty technical point, but if you were in the business of cutting vinyl to put on a car, then you really want the outline for the cutter to be like this, otherwise the thing would fall into two halves if the outline continued along the intersection. So if we make this thicker, it will become even more obvious. Okay, like this. Yeah. So this is now the red path is where the vinyl cutter would cut the plastic, and so you've got one piece that you can stick on the window. Right, and in fact, for many years, someone asked me how he could be able to cut out a line and give a line an outline. So this is one way to do this. Finally, that works 2x2.
It's like a Matisse.
Yes, you think I should save this and try.
Copyright.
Yes. Yeah, just a couple of days ago, my little daughter has drawn her first drawing, which looks rather similar to this, except that she doesn't have the strength to really put the crayon down very firmly, so it's a very light drawing.
And she didn't use artworks?
And she didn't use artworks, no. Even though you wouldn't believe how she is fond of all sorts of computers and tablets and so on. I mean, when I was that age, I didn't know there was a computer. But because she's growing up with all that technology around her, and if she sees something colorful, things are moving and so on, of course she's fascinated by that. Right. Anything else? Any other questions about Artworks, Easy Writer?
So I just wanted something apropos what you said just now about the two parts crossing being one continuous pattern.
Yeah.
Suppose you wanted to do a drawing of a ribbon, say, in a big knot. You'd have a ribbon and it would go over the top of the
okay.
And you don't want it to join up like that.
Ah, right.
Is that possible?
Oh, yes, of course. In that case, in that case, all you'd have to do was take one of the control points, like this one, and you break the line Ah, okay. It would be possible if just you could do it. No, the solution is of course to simply draw two lines. So if I shorten this a bit, and I draw a new line, then of course that would be on top of the other one. Now the tricky question is, how do we make these join up properly here? I'm sure it can be done somehow. So we put them on top of each other. Of course, with this particular line pattern, it is tricky to make these join up properly. You'd have to do some manual fudging here. What you can do is, of course, to just draw a blue circle, no outline, and try to move that. Try to move that over the joint here. Yeah, good enough for now, I think. Okay, so at that zoom factor you wouldn't actually know the difference, and now you've got a proper intersection here where the one end goes over the other. Of course, you know that as soon as you want to move things around, you will have to recreate the patching you did here.
Well, in that circumstance, I invariably forget to group, and then I move it, and I find I've left it. So somewhere.
Yes, of course, if you want to move this around. But then, of course, as always, undo and group it, and then everything should behave as it should. Now you can move this around. Yeah, but it's a good question. Yeah, the bottom line is there is always a solution somehow, but it's in terms of using this in a real world project. The question is always, how easy is it to edit things afterwards? Obviously, if you look at this structure here, you could even create that in Draw if you had a lot of time and patience. It's just a question of being able to edit it afterwards, and that's the real strength of these artistic lines. At any time, you can still go and drag around their control points and change the way the line is.
What happens if you export that artworks file as a draw file? Is any of the information about the fantasy lines preserved, but just not displayed in draw?
Oh, you can try. Of course, what you get, and you will see that in a moment, is a file that looks exactly like the one in Artworks. More or less without the anti-aliasing. But of course, now this is all represented using ordinary paths. So, and that was a good question actually, because it emphasizes the point I was just making. In Artworks, I can just change the way this line, the path this line takes anytime. Just edit this endpoint and it will adjust. Now in Draw, what do we have? I go to the editing tool. A whole load of control points. Supposing I wanted to do this very simple operation of, oh, let's make it like this. In Artworks, it's one click. In Draw, I'd be moving around like 1,000 control points. And in fact, there's absolutely no chance I would ever get this right, because I couldn't just move around all these points. So that really means Draw is certainly good enough to display the result here. But there is so much more information in the Artworks file. And in fact, if you go to wireframe mode in Artworks, you can see the hull of this line And you can see the central line, the actual trajectory of the line, and that is the important thing, and that's the part that isn't exported to Draw, because Draw wouldn't know what to do with it. To Artworks, what really defines this line is this center line, and that's what you can edit. Oops. And as you can see, we've got our ordinary path control points here that you can drag around. And every time you drag around one of these points or change the curvature, Artworks regenerates this outline that follows the line profile you define. Let's go back to what we're doing. And of course, at any time, you can also choose to change the line profile that you apply, so you can turn your ripple line into this ribbon, and so on. Right.
Can you show me how you would export that as a 300 dots per inch PDF file?
Okay. Yes. So there are actually two issues here. When you export as PDF, and that's very easy to do, go to File, Export, PDF, and you just drag the PDF file anywhere you want. And there we go. In fact, let's see what the PDF viewer makes of it. This is the standard Pling PDF viewer on RISC OS. And as you can see, this line had a graduated fill. It comes out as gray because the RISC OS PDF viewer is not clever enough to show graduations. But, and I've got a very old version here. Still, that won't do. The latest Pling PDF offers a so-called bitmap viewing mode, which does a far more sophisticated rendering of the file, which displays all the graduations as well. Just wish I had put it on here. But never mind. So that was exporting as a PDF file. Now, it wasn't a 300 dot per inch PDF file because that doesn't make any sense in the context of PDF, because PDF is fully vector-based, so you get all the full mathematical resolution of these shapes in Artworks in your PDF file. It's not like you have to specify a resolution here. If there are any bitmaps in the file, then these are just put in the PDF file in the full resolution that you have, in which you have put them into Artworks. So in contrast to other programs, Artworks doesn't actually offer a resolution setting for PDF export. You'll get the full quality of your Artworks file in the PDF file.
So you have to make sure your bitmaps are 300 dpi when you put them into Artworks.
Yes, but you would have to make sure of that anyway, because if you did put in a 100 dpi bitmap, and even if you could tell Artworks to export as 300, there is little point in it, because the extra resolution would be for nothing. You would just scale up the bitmap, and it wouldn't gain any information. You cannot magically create resolution that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
But since you talked about 300 dpi, of course we can export as a bitmap. So, for instance, as a sprite for the RISC OS world, but of course we can also have a TIFF, a JPEG, or a PNG, and there, of course, it is vital what resolution we want. Okay, it's gone again. Does it have some sort of a timeout or something? What did you do last time? Just take a short nap in between. Now, when you export as a bitmap, first of all, you choose which area to export. Like, for instance, the whole page. Or drawing means just the area covered by actual objects on the page. Now let's take the whole page. And you now got a choice to say, okay, I'd like this to have exactly 600 pixels, for instance. And then all the other parameters like the height and the scaling are set up appropriately. Or you could say, okay, I'd really like this to be 300 dpi. And now you can see what kind of width and height that would generate. So again, okay, 300 dpi, that is quite a bit for a whole A4 page. We want this as a PNG. Let's try. Ah, okay, oh, that's the RAM disk. It doesn't have enough space, obviously. Okay, oh, that's a 26-bit system. Don't have enough memory for that. Okay. Great demonstration. It would work if you had enough memory. Should have tried this before. Yeah. So, any more questions?
How could you project text onto a sphere or other similar object? Is there a way of doing that?
There is actually, yes. And it's not even any of the new features I put in. Let me find something. Well, okay, so we've got some text. There is a tool that is called the molder, the mold tool. And what this does is it puts a frame around the object you want to mold, and you now can just drag around some handles to mold the object into any shape. So obviously it's up to you to find the right perspective to make this look like it was on a sphere. Artworks doesn't particularly help you in this respect. But with some trial and error, you can drag this around like it was printed on a piece of rubber, and you can sort of as if you could just pull at the different sides of this piece of rubber. In fact, if you look at one of my posters, let's try and find one.
Again, what's your signal?
Oh, well, as we know, it will come back in a moment.
Oh, right, you are.
Oh,
sorry,
again.
I think it's when you move the mouse off over the edge.
Just catching the cable, yeah.
Ah, okay, that could be the problem. Let's just move this machine a bit. Oh, it's quite temperamental, this thing.
Who invented HDR?
That was the different example. There we go. Down here, there is my company logo. And this is actually using the mold tool to create the impression of the MW software script being molded or being projected onto a sphere. One of the first artworks files I did must have been 15 years ago, I think. In fact, if we ungroup this, we should be able, yeah, there it is. There you can see the mold that has been used to distort the logo for the sphere. If we remove that mold, it all goes. can't say that was intended. So why does it go?
They go behind the sphere.
That could be the case, yes. Let's see. Okay, try once again. Remove.
Yeah.
Where did it end up? Nowhere. Okay, I could almost be tempted to admit that this could look like a bug. Okay. So that's all about the mode tool. Anything else?
When you import a draw file into Artworks that contains a moderate large bitmap, why can it take so long before it displays it, before it finishes importing it? 30 seconds in some cases.
Yes, that's very, very slow. The reason is inside the architecture of Artworks. That was designed well before I got involved with it. Artworks has a very clever import-export system. You can imagine there are many different import formats and export formats. And at the same time, there are many different components within Artworks that handle the different object types. So if you think of like 15 Artworks components trying to import something and 15 import formats, then that's a lot of combinations that have to be dealt with. So the guys at Computer Concepts had a brilliant idea. They convert any incoming file into EPS, a Postscript format, and that Postscript is then passed around inside Artworks to be converted further. And so all the tools, all the Artworks components only need to understand Postscript. All the importers only need to be able to convert whatever comes into Postscript, which is a great idea, but it means there is a lot of work, really hard work going on inside Artworks, especially with bitmaps. So when you drag in a draw file, the bitmaps in the draw file are actually converted into Postscript, into an ASCII representation of the bitmap, which is then converted back to the draw bitmap by the appropriate tool. So that is very inefficient. And in particular, when things become large, with large bitmaps, it can take a long time. But then, of course, import and export are not features you use a lot. You use import once to get your file into Artworks, then you edit within Artworks, which is fast. And then you export again, which might be slow. So that's the reason.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Right. Any more questions, anyone?
A supplementary then. Is
Okay.
it quicker to import a Postscript file?
Probably not, because you won't be able to generate one. Because Artworks doesn't import general Postscript. It just imports a very specific encapsulated Postscript format, the Artworks EPS format, and a few other formats which are not really anymore in use nowadays. So it might be quicker if you imported a PDF, because that's done in a different way. The PDF importer should deal with a bitmap.
The PDF importer is excellent, but the particular thing I'm trying to do is convert draw files to PDF, so that would assume the solution.
Yes. And in fact, there is a different problem with the PDF importer. At the moment, it always imports things as 60 million color bitmaps. So if your bitmaps had fewer colors than that, you actually blow up the size of the bitmap unnecessarily.
It doesn't. There are one or two other points.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Well, in that case, thank you for attending this ad hoc, unplanned theater talk. And,